Hello everyone, welcome to my review of Gungrave Gore. First of all, this is not a softball style review. I don't do that sort of thing here on the channel, and subscribers know that I am generally much more critical than the majority of YouTubers out there with my reviews. Secondly, I must apologize for my weak voice. I've actually lost my voice, but the algorithm waits for no man, and so the show must go on. And so Gungrave Gore. This game is getting absolutely hammered in mainstream reviews on Steam. It is just not going to turn out well when it comes to the Metacritic score. And I promise you, I'm not just here being a hipster. This is just another example of what mainstream reviewers and players value in an action game versus what I value in an action game, not lining up with one another, and in fact being quite opposite from one another in a lot of cases. And this is a trend that we've seen with Sifu, with Turtle Shredder's Revenge, and with Bayonetta 3, where I thought all three of those games were overrated because of the reasons I explained in my videos. And now we have the opposite, where we have Gungrave Gore, where I think this game is being undervalued and over-criticized by mainstream reviews. And once again, I just have to point out how funny it is how synchronized mainstream reviewers are. They all agree with each other. If it's a positive review, they all agree with each other. When it's a negative review, it's just so funny how you never see anymore a game coming out and getting really good ratings with one outlet and poor ratings with another, and there's kind of a back and forth. That just doesn't happen. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the Electric Underground is here to present my defense of Gungrave Gore. First of all, let's talk about the main critique I'm seeing across a lot of Steam reviews and mainstream reviews, which is the game's level design. So a lot of people's words, the level design is too linear, it has too much combat, and it's just really boring and repetitive. So I saw all these critiques, and that kind of painted a picture in my mind of you're just walking down a hall and just shooting the same enemy over and over with no variation. That is absolutely not the case in Gungrave Gore. Secondly, I think the critique of an action game's level design being too linear, I think that style of critique needs to go back to 2010 or whenever they started doing it, because if you look across the history of action games, many of the greatest action games of all time have purely linear level design. It's just when we enter the 3D era, now all of a sudden we need to have branching paths and sections where you just wander around and solve Zelda-style puzzles or whatever the expectation is, or maybe like Bayonetta, where you have these sequences where you ride a dragon and then you do anything but actually engage in the combat. And as I brought up in the Bayonetta 3 review, I think this style of level design is really overdone and just a lot of bloat. You're not focusing on what the game does best and why people are buying the game, which is the core combat system. And so Gungrave Gore makes the sin of actually focusing on the core combat with its level design. Secondly, on the aspect of level design, I don't think a lot of these reviewers were really engaging with the game's beat system and with the game's scoring system and just the game's deeper mechanics, because they would realize, okay, the beat system is actually a chaining system throughout the level, where as you're going through the level, you can actually chain together the different enemy encounters like you can do in shmups, like in Donpachi or Zero Ranger. And what's really cool is if you get really good and you get really familiar with the game's level design, you can actually chain across the entire level and do these massive combos. And so I think the level design is actually fantastic because the developers went through and they added in all these links and they made sure there wasn't too much shit getting in the way to prevent your chain from going through the stage. And there's actually a lot of replay value with the level design as well, because you need to memorize somewhat where to go and how to hit certain links and what to shoot. And there's actually a lot of interaction between you and the stage. So I think it's really funny how one of the strongest aspects of this game's design, the levels and environments, are being criticized, where other character action games like Bayonetta 3, I would say have much weaker level design. And that's totally, it's all good, you know, no problems there. Bayonetta 3, we all agree, is a masterpiece day one, so we can't critique that game's level design, but we will critique Gungrave Gore's level design, when in my opinion, it's much better. It's much better because one, it's compressed in, it's focusing on the core combat. You jump in, you're playing through the stage, you're blasting your way through, and the whole time it's giving you variation, but the variation is designed around the core gameplay. So the variation of the enemy types, the variation of the environmental hazards. That's another thing I don't think that was quite commented on, is actually how much you interact with the stage itself. You use it to set up chains, you use it to set up booby traps for the enemies. You do a lot of spacing, and it matters where you stand in the stage and where you move. Like, all of that actually matters. And so I actually thought the level design of the game was fantastic and probably one of the best aspects of the game, and I wouldn't change it. I would not go in and add sections where you free roam, or add sections where you ride a dragon, or add sections where you're just running through an empty corridor. Go ahead and fire up Bayonetta, pull out a stopwatch and hit it, and see how often you are just running through empty halls. But for some reason, that's great game design. Just add a bunch of empty halls and make the levels bigger for no reason, and that's great design. I actually liked what they did here. They made it more compact, they made it more meaningful, and where you stand and what you do, and it all links together. And if you're really good, you can actually memorize the entire stage and link it into a giant combo. I think that is really cool. So for me, I just cannot agree at all with the game's level design being boring. At first, I disliked that train stage. So the first time you play the train stage, you're gonna hate this motherfucking stage. You'll be like, okay, this is where the reviewers all pulled out their notebooks and were like, oh, this game sucks because the train stage. But if you think about this game more like an arcade game versus an RPG, which I think most reviewers view games as now, they're RPGs, where if you realize, okay, you actually need to learn the stage and learn what the stage wants you to do, and the booby traps. And the stages aren't super long, by the way. They're only like 6 to 7 minutes long, 8, 9, depending. And the better you get, the faster you go through the stages, actually. And the train stage goes from being a pain in the butt to actually being a pretty fun stage. One of my favorites by the end, just because it is actually introducing some environmental variety. The second critique that I'm seeing a lot is the game's enemy design, where it said the enemies are all the same. It's all very linear. It's all very played out. And I'll admit, when I first saw footage of this game, I was worried about this, because a lot of the footage you're seeing enemies shooting rockets, and then the player hitting the rockets back, and then enemies running around with shields, and the player having to do special charge shot to break the shields. And I was like, oh no, we're gonna go full Simon Says here. It's gonna be like playing DMC, the Devil May Cry reboot or something, where you had to color match and it's all very stale and that sort of thing. Turns out, no, not the case at all. These enemies, the rocket enemies and the shield enemies, are quite a bit of fun because the way the game implements them. So on paper, this could be a disaster, but I think there was a lot of good nuance with the way they did the enemy design. Specifically, let's start with the rocket guys. So the rocket guys, as you go through the game, there are actually different types of rocket guys, and they'll shoot different styles of rockets at you. But for one, they're not all the same. And for two, you don't actually have to reflect the rocket. The rockets move slow enough that you can just walk around them, shoot around them. And for the most part, I would say you actually don't reflect the rockets. You should reflect the rockets strategically every now and again. But what these rocket guys do, their main function is not to get you to sit there and parry the rocket. If you play that way, you're not going to have a fun time. And I think that is where a lot of game reviewers are getting tripped up, and a lot of players are getting tripped up, because they're used to stuff like Sifu, where everything is very Simon Says, okay, they shoot the rocket, you parry the rocket. Like in Sifu, they do the punch, you parry the punch, the game makes you do that. Gungrave is more open-ended. You can just walk around the rockets. You do not have to reflect them, and their purpose in the game design is to make you move. That is what they're there to do. They're a hazard to get you to move around the screen. And I think that's actually really great, because a lot of problems that we see in modern action games, you don't have to engage and move around the screen unless you feel like it. But in Gungrave, I think it is actually a lot more fundamental and more old school, where in a shmup, for example, a sign of a good shmup is a shmup that makes you move around the screen, that forces you to move. Same with beat 'em ups. A good beat 'em up is one that forces you to move. Gungrave is doing that with these rocket guys. It is forcing you to flank around them. It is forcing you to stay mobile, and it's rewarding you for doing so. So I actually really like the rocket guys designs, and it's a fun little thing every now and again to get a counterattack off, but that's not the main point of them. And so don't play it that way. Don't sit there and reflect the rockets all day. That's not going to work out. The second enemy, the shield enemy. And again, I saw in the IGN review, they had a real big problem with these shield enemies because they're saying, okay, the shield enemies you have to hit with melee attacks, or you have to hit with a charge shot. And there's certain times where you get pinned in and neither are working, and it's big and it's screwed up and it's not well balanced and yada, yada, yada. They didn't like it. Again, I was worried about that myself, but like with the rockets, there is a lot of flexibility with these enemies, and the game's combat system is more open-ended and flexible to where it's a fun variation rather than it being a Simon Says style, okay, you have to do this. What I'm talking about is the shield enemies and a lot of the enemy types in the game, whether it's the flamethrower guys, the guys with the melee attacks, the rocket guys, the shield guys, a lot of the enemies force you to do target prioritization like in shmups or in beat 'em ups. So when you see a shield enemy, they're usually spawned a good distance from you, and in your mind as a player, you have to prioritize. Oh, okay, I need to focus on this enemy, but I have to then juggle these enemies over here. And so the game is doing a lot of target prioritization and pushing you to make choices as the player and decide, what do I do here and where? And what's really good, in my opinion, again, contrary to what you read in mainstream reviews, is the game will actually punish you for screwing up. So in most action games now, there's always an emergency button. Which time? Hit the emergency button. You screwed up. Okay, that's fine. Hit which time. Everything's reset. Everything's okay. No problem. In this game, like in old school beat 'em ups and old school action games like in shmups, if you ignore the shield guys and you've got plenty of time to figure out some kind of strategy on them, if you ignore them and they corner you, guess what? You are going to get punished for that. You are going to have to start playing the game more proactively. So I actually like how the shield enemies, you have to plan for them, you have to strategize for them. And also I think there's techniques for doing the charge shot that, again, I think are being overlooked. And so with that said, let's talk now about how this game works, because I think if you are understanding what the game is designed around and what it's wanting you to do, a lot of these things are going to click into place and it's going to be a lot more fun and it's going to work, right? Sometimes a unique game comes out every now and again, you know, shocker, every now and again, a unique-ish game comes out and you actually do have to kind of learn the systems of the combat and figure out what the game is wanting you to do. And then you can evaluate after that point. But I think, as is often happens with more unique combat systems, is viewers come in, they expect it to play one way, it doesn't play that way, so the game's bad and broken, right? So when you're reading the reviews, there's a lot of critiques of the melee combat of this game. Melee combat is not good, it's not strong, it's unreliable. All true. The melee combat is not good, it's not strong, and it's unreliable. But my point is, that is by design, I believe, because this game is not Bayonetta. It is not a character action game. It is a shooter. You are supposed to be shooting your enemies. That's kind of like if anyone's played the original Red Dead Revolver. There's melee attacks in the original Red Dead Revolver, but guess what? They suck. That's because they're supposed to be limited. They're not supposed to be the main way you combat the enemies. And I think that's the way Gungrave works. The rule, in my opinion, is use your guns. Most of the time, if you can use your guns, use your guns. Do not use the melee attack, because the melee attack isn't very strong. It takes quite a while to come out, and then even after you hit, it takes a long time on recovery. The melee is supposed to be very specific and limited. So that's my first gameplay tip, and you'll see in all my footage here. Use those guns. Fire the guns. It's about the guns, baby. The second thing we definitely need to talk about is the charge shot. So the charge shot is hella good, and it gets better once you kind of know how it works. So the charge shot is a little bit funky, but once you get the feel for it, it's going to really open things up for you. First of all, you actually have to shoot before you can buffer your charge. And I think that's going to be a point of contention for a lot of players. And I don't know if this is like a balancing decision, or maybe they should go ahead and patch it to where you can buffer without shooting first. I'm not entirely sure whether that's right or wrong at this point, but the way it works now is you need to fire at least one shot, and then if you hold down the shot from that point, you will buffer your charge. And so a technique that I've sort of come up with that I like to call dive buffering, which is you shoot, you hold, and then you cancel with a dive. While you're diving, you're actually still charging. So on a lot of the shield enemies, for example, what you can do, shoot, hold, dive backwards, and by the time you land, you can charge shot them, and you're still mobile, you're still moving around, you're just in a dive. There's that, and there's also just different ways you can set up buffers as you're shooting. Like you're shooting an enemy, you see the charge guy coming, you hold on that last shot, kind of like free step dodge in Bayonetta, kind of like that. You hold, and then you charge and move and fire. Also, I'm pretty sure when you're fully charged, you actually run faster. So what you can do is you can shoot, hold, and then run, and you'll run faster, and then you can blast them. And then there's also the lock-on option. And if you pair that with the charge, now things are coming together. And you can see in the footage here, you can see how much I'm using just free fire guns into charges, into dives, into lock-ons. I mean, there's a lot of really cool stuff with the core combat of the game. And as far as the enemy types, I was seeing people in reviews saying that the enemy types are pretty limited. Again, I think it could have used some more enemy types, especially in the mid stages. I think the mid stages would have benefited, but these critiques of it being just these long slogs, I don't think is fair, especially compared to modern games now, where they're all long slogs. The entire game's a long slog. So now let's get to some of my critiques of the game. First of all, the game is a little janky. I will absolutely agree with that, with some of the things, like some of the enemy types, their AI and the things they do seem to be a little bit under-programmed, right? They lack a little bit of nuance in terms of like the melee attacks, or if you're trying to jump on things, or you can get caught in the environment in weird ways. Like, it's one of those games where you gotta be mindful of what you're up to, otherwise you can kind of break the game in ugly ways from time to time. I'm hoping with patching and everything, a lot of this will be smoothed out, but it just really reminds me of old school PS2 action games. Like, this is the kind of shit you see in like Red Dead Revolver, right? Red Dead Revolver, I love that game. We can admit it's a little bit janky, but once you kind of get used to it and understand, okay, this is what the game's gonna do, I think it's the kind of jank that arcade players are gonna be more forgiving of than mainstream gamers, where they want really smooth, really evened out, no difficulty spikes, no funkiness at all. And another thing is the hit stun of the game can be a little bit funky at times, where it feels like maybe if the enemies are in certain states, they're not fully registering the hit stun, and they'll kind of power through things in weird ways, or it's just a little bit unpolished when it comes to the finesse of the programming here and there. I don't think it's absolutely broken or anything, but there are going to be things that you'll look and say, okay boys, this was not fully QA tested. Like, you'll jump and get stuck on a rail. There are random bugs like that, but as far as the core gameplay itself, I wasn't running into as many bugs as other players were, and maybe that's because the way I'm playing the game is more focused on the guns and the ranged combat. And I think it's when you try to do melee stuff that you're going to be running into a lot of issues. So final conclusions, I had a surprising amount of fun with this game. Non-ironically, not being a hipster, I sat down and was playing this game and I was just like, I'm playing a game. This is a video game, boys. Not a bunch of cutscenes, not a bunch of weird digressions, not bullshit walking sections. You're just getting into the stages, you're battling your way through it. You're not doing a bunch of RPG mechanics. That was another critique people had. They wanted more leveling, they wanted more unlocking of things. For me, I prefer to have most of the game's core combat there at the beginning. Maybe you can upgrade some things and add some things here or there. But that's not something I like about the Devil May Cry games, for example, where your first playthrough, you're playing like underpowered and you have to learn all your attacks. And so the game actually begins after your first playthrough when you do New Game Plus. I don't really like that. I like a more full set, you coming into the game, and you can unlock some stuff as you go, but I'm not a big fan of unlocks and skill trees and shit like that. I like to have the levels and the stages escalate rather than your character, if that makes sense. So again, that was not something that I would consider a flaw by any means. It's just a breath of fresh air in my opinion. I had a ton of fun with it. Fair warning, you are going to be hammering that trigger a lot. So if you can get it on PC or on Xbox, I'd recommend it because I think Xbox controllers have better triggers, and the PS4 trigger I think is kind of janky. So yeah, I absolutely recommend it. It's not going to be for everyone. If you want that sort of mainstream God of War Ragnarok sort of experience, you're not going to find it here. But if you're loving that PS2 era action game stuff and you miss it, and you want more of it in your life, we went from Red Dead Revolver, which I love, to Red Dead Redemption, which I don't love. If you're a fan of those style of games, Max Payne 1, the original Max Payne, this is going to be up your alley. But if you want your God of Wars and your Bayonetta 3s and that sort of stuff, Sifu, you probably won't like it, just to warn you. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, Bo, Ben, Bettino, Blur SDG, Borgie22, Brian Shiver, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Clammy Coyote, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Disco Stoslaya, DJ420, Praise It, Eric H, Fantaside, FCK, Full Set, Retro Schmupper, Housu, J, JLab, JBRPG, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, KZ, Khalil Reedy, Contain, Larridge, Malaise, Matthew Dergish, Maz, Megadeth859, Minung, Mechalin, Michael Stum, Mitchell Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron Neon Dagger Games, Okla Kugels, Psycho Blizzard, Rattlecat, Raoul, Real Skeen, Riff Mason, Rolf015, Sarah, Scanline City, Seesaw SDG, 7 Overdose, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Steve Fiction, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, Twilight EX, Utakoi Roots, Wabby Legs, Bog Hog, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.